How's it going, everybody? My name is TheStarkz and welcome back to another The Last of Us Part 3 video. Well, according to Neil Druckmann at Naughty Dog, The Last of Us Part 3 might not happen. On a website provided by Polygon.com, they state that The Last of Us will only return if Naughty Dog knows exactly the right story to tell. HBO's adaptation of The Last of Us is just wrapping up, but that hasn't stopped fans from being excited about where the video game series could go next after 2018's The Last of Us Part 2. This is strange because The Last of Us Part 2 did not come out in 2018, so whoever wrote this article is misinformed. It came out in 2020. Anyway, during his press tour for the show, game series creative director and HBO show co-creator Neil Druckmann updated everyone on the status of The Last of Us Part 3 and the fact that it might not happen at all. In an interview with BuzzFeed, Druckmann said that Naughty Dog hasn't made a decision yet about what's next for the mainline The Last of Us series, and it doesn't feel pressured to either. He states, "We're very privileged that our publisher is Sony," Druckmann said. "They have supported us every step of the way to follow our passions, meaning that just because something is successful, people think there's all this pressure that we have to make a sequel. That's not the case. For us, Uncharted was insanely successful. Uncharted 4 was one of the best-selling games, and we're able to put our final brushstroke on that story and say that we're done. We're moving on. Likewise with The Last of Us. It's up to us whether we want to continue or not." Now, the article goes on to state that doesn't mean the series is done for sure, though. According to Neil Druckmann, the team is batting story ideas back and forth all the time in hopes that something sticks. But until they have the perfect one, we shouldn't expect another entry in the franchise just yet. Quote, "Our process is the same thing we did when we did The Last of Us Part 2, Druckmann said to BuzzFeed, which is if we can come up with a compelling story that has the universal message and statement about love, just like the first and second game did, then we will tell that story. If we can't come up with something, we have a very strong ending with Part 2, and that will be the end." And the article goes on to talk about a little bit about The Last of Us multiplayer, but not much going forward. Now, on another article provided by whatifgaming.com, they talk about The Last of Us Part 3, its plot, release date, and more. And in this article, they have a sub headline that says, "Will there be a Last of Us Part 3?" And they state that, yes, The Last of Us Part 3 will be happening. It's been seemingly confirmed that the script has undergone completion to some extent. The game is reportedly in the early pre-production stages. Now, this article was published on December 26th of 2022, so over a month ago now, but they post a tweet by Oops Leaks. Now, this tweet was conducted on March 31st, 2022, nearly a year ago, stating that Naughty Dog's new IP, next major single-player title, Neil Druckmann is not involved, fantasy setting, at least what it looks like, currently in full production. Now, that's one tweet. A follow-up tweet states that The Last of Us Part 3 is nothing but official statements from the studio. The outline of the script is ready, but the studio is engrossed in the development of the aforementioned projects. It is possible that the development will begin faster than expected due to studios' expansion. Now, that's a wild claim. I don't know how much merit this Oops Leaks person has, but what I find really interesting about all of this is that, yes, that's true. Naughty Dog's Neil Druckmann, I think, himself said, "Hey, we have a script for an outline for The Last of Us Part 3. And what I find really funny about all of this is I actually have a Twitter page. I'm not too active on there anymore. I try to limit my time on social media, specifically Twitter, because of how divisive and just unnecessarily argumentative it can be. But what I find really funny is how last month in January, I replied to some tweet talking about how I don't think that The Last of Us Part 3 would happen. So here we go. It's from Naughty Dog Central on Twitter, Naughty Dog NDC, and they were like, "Would you like to see Tindrils in the next The Last of Us game?" And I replied saying, "Really doubt there will be another The Last of Us game." Now, that generated a lot of people kind of going back and forth replying to me, and that was, like I said, on the 24th of January. And days later, what I find hilarious is there is a post January 26th from Games Radar, The Last of Us Part 3 will only happen if Naughty Dog can find the right story to tell. And in a lot of my replies, people were saying, well, of course it's going to be The Last of Us Part 3. Look at the way it ends. It was very ambiguous, just as the Part 1 was. And, you know, there's so much story and expansion. They could talk about Abby and all these other characters, which is very true. And listen, I'm quite the fan of The Last of Us. I've been playing its multiplayer and the games for many years now. I have over 1,000 hours on The Last of Us factions alone. However, and I've said this in my reply, is that Sony is very particular. So I'll grab the article here. So from Dom the Bomb on Twitter, good guy, great content creator. He talked a little bit about the excerpt from Neil Druckmann, stating Neil's take on the Uncharted ending. Just because something is successful, people think there's all this pressure that we have to make a sequel. Uncharted 4 was one of the best-selling games, and we're able to put a final brushstroke to that story and say that we're done, we're moving on. And I replied, talking about how PlayStation grants their studios a ton of creative freedom, and people on the internet assume that continuations will be made simply due to a game's success, which just isn't true. Which is true. That is very true. What I'm saying is true. And what I find really funny about what I said is I hadn't read this article from Polygon, from Games Radar, from What If Gaming. I haven't read any of these articles. And in this article, I just read it for you guys, that from what Neil Druckmann said is that PlayStation grants them that flexibility to tell these stories and conclude them, right? And that is the power of what PlayStation and Sony in particular. Here's what Neil Druckmann said. We're very privileged that our publisher is Sony. They have supported us every step of the way to follow our passions, meaning that just because something is successful, people think that there's all this pressure that we have to make a sequel. And that's just not the case. And I find that hilarious because this is the first time I'm reading this article, and that's what I find funny is everyone was talking about how you're wrong, StarkZ, The Last of Us Part 3 is happening. And don't get me wrong, I think Sony, PlayStation and Naughty Dog recognize the power and the powerhouse that The Last of Us Part 3 is. I would love to see Naughty Dog explore this world one more time. Do I think that there's enough story to be told or justified? Possibly, right? There's all kind of things that they could talk about, but ultimately, The Last of Us is a story about love and the conditions of love. However, there's so many different underlining themes and motifs about this game that focuses specifically on Ellie and Joel. And so if Naughty Dog really deviates from that core narrative, I think people would be really upset. And I think I said it in a few videos in the past where I said I don't know how much story there is for The Last of Us Part 3 to be told, but if Naughty Dog can pull it off, I have full confidence that they could, and I would still support their game nonetheless. But here we have it. Neil Druckmann, who, by the way, created The Last of Us in partnership with Bruce Straley, who for some reason doesn't get mentioned a lot, but Bruce Straley is instrumental to the creation of The Last of Us. So I just want to put that out there. But Neil Druckmann said it himself, who's now the vice president at Naughty Dog, is that, if there's enough story to be told, we'll do it. But if not, we're satisfied with the way The Last of Us Part 2 ended. And so am I. I think it was a beautiful telling of Ellie's and Joel's story with additions to Abby's character, and Naughty Dog really, really defied conventions by making us play Abby, who is obviously the person who killed Joel. Really bold of Naughty Dog to do. But nonetheless, The Last of Us Part 2, it ended, I think, wonderfully. And so I think if Naughty Dog revisits The Last of Us Part 3, they're going to be treading on some mighty thin ice. and I mean that seriously. I mean, I think Naughty Dog can pull it off, but I don't know if they can really tell a contained story with just Ellie, with, I guess, Abby being a little bit involved, and how could they reintroduce Joel and that side of Ellie's trauma. And, I know a lot of people are saying, Ellie could be a story about both of these characters finding redemption and Ellie kind of sacrificing herself in spite of all the events that transpired in Part 1 and Part 2. But I think that's a little too dramatic. I don't know if Ellie would want to do that. I think she could find redemption in her own ways. But nonetheless, The Last of Us Part 3 might not happen. I really find that so funny because, Twitter people were just mad at me that I said, I don't know if The Last of Us Part 3 will ever happen. And then here we have it, days later, The Last of Us Part 3 might not actually happen, according to Neil Druckmann. So whether this is true or not, we don't know. I don't work for Naughty Dog as much as I would love to. I know when I was younger, I used to fantasize about working for Naughty Dog. At the time, I was pursuing video game development. I deviated from that course or from that career path. I'm now doing something else, but I'm a huge fan of Naughty Dog and I love their games and I'll support them anyway. But it's really interesting to see Neil Druckmann, the co-creator of The Last of Us and obviously the vice president now at Naughty Dog, talk in some length about their series, because these are important. And I think this is really mature of the studio. I know in the past I said Neil Druckmann doesn't represent Naughty Dog, but he is this kind of the person at the forefront of the image of Naughty Dog. And for him to come out and say that they're satisfied with Uncharted, they're going to move on, whether they continue it in the future is very unlikely. But The Last of Us, it's possible, but it really depends on whether they want to continue it or not. And Sony might push Naughty Dog, hey, we want you to continue with The Last of Us because it's this powerhouse of an IP. But if Naughty Dog can't justify a really compelling story, then it's not going to happen. And I think the fact that Neil Druckmann said this means to me that Naughty Dog is working on The Last of Us factions and they're working on a new IP, which is what I've been saying for the past months now, right? I don't think The Last of Us Part 3 is going to happen anytime soon, and if it does, we're not going to hear about it until maybe 2025. Let's be real here. And then maybe it'll release in 2026 or 2027. But as far as I'm aware, I have every reason to believe that Naughty Dog is working on The Last of Us factions and a new IP. But I'm curious to know everyone else's thoughts and opinions regarding this, because obviously you're watching this video, you're probably a fan of Naughty Dog and The Last of Us, but maybe not. Maybe you've never played The Last of Us, or maybe you're not familiar with Naughty Dog, which if that's the case, hello, I'm TheStarkz. I make videos on The Last of Us. I quite enjoy it. I love Naughty Dog as well. But I'm curious to know everyone's thoughts about The Last of Us Part 3 and the fact that it might not actually happen. Like, do you think Neil Druckmann is just saying that so people aren't too hyped about The Last of Us Part 3 or making all these theory videos? That way, when they finally announce that it actually is happening, people are more surprised by this? Or do you think Neil Druckmann, there's a lot of truth to this, and that, like I've been saying, there's not enough story, or if there is, they'll pursue it, but right now they're working on Factions, which is their multiplayer standalone project, which is confirmed, and then possibly a new IP. Let me know all of that in the comment section below, and of course, with everything being said, I've been TheStarkz. Peace.